So good evening to all of you, and to all of you who are coming to Sintra for the first time, welcome to the Sintra family. This is the 2024 edition, and this is very much a family that comes together annually. And given that we value family, I would like to dedicate this evening to a newly born baby in the family of our friend Jay Powell, born 3 years ago. A baby, Jérôme, not Jay. Second, I would like to apologize to our Portuguese friends and colleagues, including the waiters who are looking after us, because Portugal-Slovenia has started exactly 10 minutes ago. And I think that we should really do them a favor by eating fast and letting them clear the table and watch the game. Mario, Constantino, thank you so much for your hospitality. We'll try to be fast and to clear tables so that you and you colleagues can watch the game. Bostian, where are you? Okay, Bostian, we will also cheer for you. Slovenia. All right. So the theme of the conference this year is monetary policy in an era of transformation. And we have a rich program ahead of us exploring the changes that are taking place. And I would like on this occasion to thank all those of you who have committed papers, who are producing research, analysis. Your work will be discussed and your views will be debated tomorrow and Wednesday, and we're all looking forward to it. So, transformation, that's the theme. I guess if most of us can agree that the economy is undergoing profound changes, I imagine that there are more diverging views about how and where it will end up. So I'm going to use the quote of someone who has spent a lot of time dealing with uncertainty and trying to assess people. This is what he said. Sometimes you're not sure. Sometimes you doubt. Sometimes you have to guess. And sometimes you just know. Sounds familiar? It happens to many of you? Well, if it is the case, then you are exactly in the same position as the very famous, he's not a philosopher, he's not an economist, he's just the former Manchester United manager, Sir Alex Ferguson. And occasionally he lacked clarity, but not that often. So this lack of clarity presents a profound challenge for policymakers, as we must try at once to understand these transformations and to steer the economy through them. Indeed, much of the policy challenge over the last few years has involved stabilizing inflation while facing fundamental uncertainty about the economy. Without the wonderful benefit of insight, without the luxury of time, and certainly without any ex-post analysis. You're in the heat of the moment. But I think we've managed to chart a path through this uncertainty, and we have come a long way to fight inflation. Let me remind you 3 numbers that some of you will know I'm using occasionally. In October 22, here in Europe, inflation peaked at 10.6%. 1 year later, which was the last time we raised rate, inflation had halved and was down to 5.2%. And after 9 months of holding rates, it halved again, down to 2.6%, which led us to cut rates for the first time in June. Our work is not done, and we need to remain vigilant. But this progress alone allows us to look back and reflect on the path that we have taken. So tonight, I would like to talk to you relatively briefly about 3 things: the risks, the path, and the cost. So let me start with the risks. What was at risk? In a typical policy cycle, when fluctuations are driven by moderate and short-lived shocks, inflation expectations are usually not at risk. Central banks' price stability mandates and reaction functions ensure confidence in the inflation target. When faced with typical demand shocks, central banks reach their target by stabilizing demand around potential output. And when faced with supply shocks, central banks can, in principle, look through them, as these shocks will usually leave no lasting imprint on inflation. But this low risk to inflation expectations only applies when shocks are indeed moderate and short-lived. In situations when there is a risk of shocks becoming larger and more persistent, inflation expectations can very well de-anchor, regardless of whether the shocks are demand-led or supply-led. We'll discuss that tomorrow, I know. Central banks must then react forcefully to prevent above-target inflation becoming entrenched. And this was the lesson of the 70s, when a sequence of supply shocks caused by rising oil prices ultimately morphed into a lasting inflationary shock. And with central banks at the time being seen as ambivalent about bringing down inflation, people revised their expectations about medium-term inflation. So different studies reach different conclusions about the origin of the current inflation episode. Supply, demand, how much supply was it? How much demand was it? How did they interlink? How did one fuel the other? Our analysis at the ECB finds that at the peak, supply shocks were 3 times more important than demand shocks in explaining the deviation of inflation from its mean. Other research puts a greater emphasis on demand shocks. But you know, this delineation between supply and demand, while relevant, has not been, in my view, the most important factor in our current cycle. We needed to base our decisions not only on the source of the shock, but also on their size and persistence. And this was because the shock was so large and persistent that we faced a genuine risk to inflation expectations. 2 features could have provided fertile ground for people to lose confidence in the monetary anchor. First, the shocks were large enough to really catch the attention of households. At the start of 23, over 60% of respondents to our consumer expectations survey reported that they were paying more attention to inflation than in the past. Second, the inflationary impact of the shocks risked becoming endogenously persistent, owing mainly to the staggered wage bargaining process that we have in Europe. And although there is heterogeneity between the countries in the euro area, the average duration of wage contracts is 2 years, effectively guaranteeing a drawn-out process to catch up with past inflation. So monetary policy had to send a strong signal that permanent overshoots of the inflation target would not be tolerated. And as a result, we strongly emphasized our determination to ensure, note the adverb, a timely return to target. It was not randomly there. Our aim was to convey our commitment to ensuring that the period of high inflation would be limited and would signal a sense of urgency. But how does monetary policy anchor inflation expectations? It is not only about the policy destination, but also about setting the right trajectory of rates to get to destination. And this brings me to my second specific feature of this cycle, the rate path. It was clear from the outset that merely communicating our commitment to reaching our target would not have been enough. When you're at 10%, you can say that you want to be at 2% timely. It's not going to be enough to repeat 2%. It's necessary, but it's not enough. ECB analysis shows that if we had not reacted, the risk of de-anchoring would have been above 30% in 23 and 24. It is likely that even moderate policy action would have been insufficient. For example, if rates had stopped at 2%, we were coming from minus 0.5. the risk of de-anchoring would still have been at around 24%. So when we first started raising rates, we knew that we were far from where we needed to be. And the most important factor was therefore to close that gap as quickly as possible. And this is why we had a historically steep climb at the start of our rate path, using increments of 75 and 50 basis points for our first 6 rates increases. But as policy rates moved towards restrictive territory, the challenge shifted from acting quickly to calibrating the path precisely. In particular, we needed to set a rate path that both delivered the timely return to 2% and did so with a high degree of confidence. I'm sure there will be treaties written about confidence and what we meant by confidence, but we needed that confidence. And this path also required us to take a different approach from the past. Faced with multiple large shocks, there was significant uncertainty about how to interpret and rank the information we were receiving from the economy. On the one hand, it would have been risky to rely too much on models trained on historical data, as those data may no longer have been valid. We could not know, for instance, whether shifts in preferences, higher energy prices, or geopolitical development had changed the structure of the economy. On the other hand, relying too much on current data might have been equally misleading if they had turned out to have little predictive power for the medium term. As shocks worked their way through the economy, current data could also have reflected lags more than actual inflation trends. So you're torn between one and the other. What did we do? We constructed a framework to hedge against this uncertainty, blending projections with current data about underlying inflation and monetary transmission. The aim was to combine various pieces of information about the medium-term outlook into a single assessment that could be updated swiftly. Our forecast provided a comprehensive assessment of future inflation, assuming the underlying parameters of the economy remain stable. But at the same time, looking at current data allowed us to identify the persistent components of inflation and account for structural changes that might have been missing from our forecast models. In this reaction function, our assessment of the inflation outlook is informed by not only our projection, but we use also various measures to gauge underlying inflation. And when assessing the strength of monetary policy transmission, we consider banks, we consider capital markets, we consider the real economy. And as a result, with the flow of new information constantly coming in, it improves our picture of the medium-term inflation. And we are not pushed around by any specific data points. We are data dependent, no question about that, but we are not data point dependent. And this framework helped us navigate the tightening and the holding phases of our policy cycle, and it gave us the confidence to deliver a first rate cut at our last policy meeting. During these phases, we have seen the right tail of the distribution of inflation expectations narrow, consistent with the timely return of inflation to target. But while the policy path has helped to tame inflation, it has also dampened economic growth. Interest rates rose steadily and remained high, while the economy was stagnating for 5 straight quarters. And this pattern is unavoidable when central banks face shocks that push inflation and output in opposing directions. But this time, the costs of disinflation have been contained compared with similar episodes of the past. And this brings me to the third and last specific feature of this cycle. Given the magnitude of the shock to inflation, a soft landing is not guaranteed. Now, what do I mean by soft landing? I would define that as avoiding either a recession or a major deterioration of employment. If we look at historical rate cycles since 1970, we can see that when major central banks hiked interest rates while energy prices were high, the cost to the economy were usually quite steep. Only around 15%, 1/5, of the successful soft landings in this period have been achieved following energy price shocks. But this cycle has so far not followed past patterns. Inflation peaked at a much higher point than during previous soft landings, and it also decelerated a lot faster. Growth has remained within the range of previous soft landing episodes, at the low end of it. And the labor market has performed exceptionally well. Employment has grown despite slowing GDP growth, rising by 2.6 million people since the end of 2022, and unemployment is at historical lows for the euro area and well within the range observed during previous soft landings across major economies. And the resilience of the labor market is itself a reflection of the unusual mix of shocks that have hit the euro area, with labor shortages leading firms to hoard more labor and higher profits and lower real wages, making it easier for them to do so. As a result, the usual propagation from slower growth to heightened unemployment risks and lower demand did not happen to the same extent at all. Now, we are still facing several uncertainties regarding future inflation, especially in terms of how the nexus of profits, wages, and productivity will evolve, and whether the economy will be hit by new supply-side shocks. And it will take time for us to gather sufficient data to be certain that the risks of above-target inflation have passed. The strong labor market means that we can take time to gather new information, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that the growth outlook remains uncertain. And all of this underpins our determination to continue to be data dependent and to take our policy decisions meeting by meetings. So our policy decisions have successfully kept inflation expectations anchored, and inflation is projected to return to 2% in the latter part of next year. Considering the size of the inflation shock, this unwinding, I know it sounds a little bit arrogant to say that, but after all, I'm French. And we won the match today, sorry. No, to the team. So I was saying, considering the size of the inflation shock, this unwinding is remarkable in many ways. Yes, it is. And we were recently at the BIS, and there were good discussions about this point, even though we should not let our guard down. Even though millions of businesses and workers have been independently striving to protect their profits and incomes, our 2% inflation target has remained credible and has continued to anchor the inflation process. And that speaks not just to the quality of those who made those decisions and to those who fueled them with their analysis and their work, but it speaks to the value of the policy frameworks that central banks have built up over the last 30 years, focusing on price stability and central bank independence. And it is why we will not waver from our commitment to bring inflation back down to our target for the benefit of all Europeans. Now, I cannot resist giving you a final quote related to football yet again. Sorry for those who can't stand football, but we have that and only that at the moment, of course, to talk about. We wish. So I'm going to quote now somebody that, Andrew, you would know, of course. The footballer and manager Sir Bobby Robson famously said, "The first 90 minutes are the most important." For those who don't know, a football match lasts 45 minutes twice, which is 90 minutes. So we will not rest until the match is won and inflation is back to 2%. It will be a matter of more than 90 minutes, but we will certainly get there in due course. Thank you very much.